think it is important that we cherish it and don't actually let it wither on the vine, which is sadly what will happen if we don't get an injection of money.
OK, no, you couldn't be clearer. Thank you very much for joining us this morning. That was Dr Claire Gerarda, former chair of the Royal College of GPs and a London GP herself, making an impassioned plea for more money for GP surgeries. And my first caller on this subject is Dr Bob Gill from Sidcup. Bob, good morning.
Hello, Nigel.
Good morning. So you heard what Claire Gerarda said. How much more money does the NHS need, Bob? And also, is it being spent properly?
Well, let me address your second point. Is it being spent properly? Well, you know how stealth and politics work. We've seen this in the EU. You go on about this yourself. The EU project started off as a trading bloc, but soon morphed into a political project.
Okay.
Well, the NHS, the equivalent stealth, the hidden truth about what's happened to the NHS is the stealth progression to privatisation and an insurance-based system. Now, in order to get us to that, the public have to be kept in the dark, and a massive management and bureaucratic infrastructure has been put in place, which is diverting 10% of the budget away from looking after patients.
So the privatisation, Bob, that you're talking about, this was begun by Tony Blair, wasn't it?
It was begun under Thatcher. You had the outsourcing of ancillary services in the hospital. It was progressed by Tony Blair, who made NHS Trust into Foundation Trust, setting them up as standalone businesses.
Yeah.
Then you had more and more outsourcing of clinical services. And now in charge of the NHS, it's not Jeremy Hunt, it's a man called Simon Stevens, whose former job was president of United Health Global, America's biggest private insurer. Now, this should be ringing alarm bells. Claire Gerarda's comments are not helpful because she did her best to avoid the elephant in the room. The elephant in the room is the NHS is being set up to collapse. The defunding has been quite deliberate, and this has been described by various people. The latest comment on a research published by Cambridge was economic murder. They estimate 120,000 people have died prematurely as a result of deliberate underfunding.
But is it possible? Yeah. Is it? Now let's just sort of think about this. Is it possible that the use of private services by the National Health Service could actually reduce costs and reduce waiting lists, and may not of itself necessarily be a bad thing?
There is no system in the world which runs a private health system which delivers universal health care at a lower cost. It just does not exist. What private companies do, they cherry pick, they will do the easiest, most profitable work and dump the expensive and complex. That's how it works. Insurance-based systems look for the healthy patients, they want to collect the premium, and as soon as they become complex or expensive, they get dumped. If you just take the cleaning service, for example, now evidence has appeared that outsourced cleaning, private cleaning in hospitals has resulted in a higher rate of MRSA, the killer bug.
Yes.
So this is the reality.
All right.
I'm a GP. I see outsourced services. They do not provide the comprehensive care that they replace, and they fragment the service, and Bob, they introduce more bureaucracy.
Bob, you think that if all of this was run by the state, by the NHS itself, we get better bang for our buck?
Definitely. The evidence is clear. You know, if you look at international comparisons, the NHS used to be 3% administrative cost. It's approaching it's past 14%.
Wow.
And the government, dare not tell us what the actual cost is.
That is an amazing statistic. 3% to 14% for the administrative cost of the National Health Service. Dr Bob Gill from Sidcup, I thank you for that call and that amazing statistic, which does suggest to me that a lot of the money may not be going quite in the right place. You're listening to the Sunday edition of the Nigel Farage Show, exclusively on LBC. It's 11:15. As 90 members of Parliament, cross-party, urge the Prime Minister and Chancellor to urgently put more money into the National Health Service, I'm asking you, are they right to make this demand? And is the money that's being put in being spent properly? And before the break, we had a doctor from Sidcup, Bob Gill, he was saying to us that actually, the middle management spend in the NHS has gone up from 3% to 14%, and he saw the privatisation of the NHS as being private companies taking money out of it for themselves and not bringing more competition. Richard in Chelsea says it's not a national health service, it's an international one. Oh, Richard, I said this a few years ago. I was screamed at. It's also saddled with time-wasting half-wits who should have gone to a chemist, plus a bunch of overpaid managers who have zero common sense. Well, one of the ways, Richard, of stopping the time wasters would be to do what they do in France. Now, in France, if you book a GP appointment and you don't turn up, you get fined €10 because you've wasted time at that GP surgery. And I know a member of my family, and she worked as a receptionist in a GP surgery. She said the remarkable thing was, firstly, the number of repeaters, i.e. people who come in once a week for a chat and clearly haven't got anything too gravely wrong with them. And secondly, the number of people who book appointments and simply don't turn up. And yet, whenever you suggest, if anyone suggests that people should pay a deposit that will be returnable for a GP appointment, everyone says that's wrong, and that would be privatisation in itself. Now, one of the things that's been said about the NHS crisis I would like to deal with right here and now. And it is that we're being told that because of Brexit, yes, of course, everything from the weather to the National Health Service that goes wrong is, of course, because of Brexit. And we saw some screaming headlines a couple of weeks ago, Radio 4's flagship Today programme, telling us that there'd been a drop of nearly 90% in EU nurses registered to work in Britain over the past year. A drop of 90%. 10,000 people gone. Catastrophe. Sir Vince Cable, picked up off the back of that and said it just showed what Brexit was doing to our nation, that people weren't welcome here anymore. And that was the story that ran until we got the truth. Because whilst everybody seemed to be happy to quote the number of EU staff leaving the NHS, no one bothered to mention last year the number of EU staff who had joined the NHS. And perhaps that's because, during the very same period, the health service statistics show that 13,013 EU citizens took up jobs in the National Health Service, a net rise of 3,181 of EU citizens working in our health service. So I think we've dispatched that one, I hope, to the boundary. Yet more of the sort of rubbish project fear that we get in this country that is not based on fact. Right, so one thing we can tick off is the crisis in the NHS is not because there are no nurses left in the country. That is nonsense. I wonder what Jill in Muswell Hill thinks. Jill, should we put in a lot more money very, very quickly, and perhaps should the Chancellor begin this on the budget this week?
I absolutely think not.
Right.
And I think not, because the fact of the matter is the NHS is broke. So let's fix it. Let's fix it.
Okay.
You know, it's really simple. It's glaringly obvious that it's broken.
So how do we... Okay, well, if I accept that it's broken, and actually virtually everybody that works in it says they're up to capacity, it is not delivering in a way that it needs to do. So what are you suggesting we do to fix it?
Well, what I'm suggesting we do, you know how we love a report or two or three?
Yeah.
Let's conduct a report and draft somebody in like Professor Patrick Munford. Get him in. Let him conduct a report. And let's see what the issues are in our NHS. And I'm thinking, once this report is conducted, that maybe he'll come up with an idea of a two-tier or three-tier NHS system. Because the truth of the matter is, life is not fair. Why should the NHS be done and conducted in such a fair way? It should not. Well,
we have had a commitment in this country since the late 1940s to a National Health Service.
The 1940s you're telling me about. It was carried out in the 1940s at such a time, and probably when we really needed such a system.
Okay, so let's take accident and emergency, shall we? Let's take road traffic accidents, for argument's sake. I mean, are you suggesting that some parts of the country should provide better A&E facilities than others?
what I'm saying is that the country, it needs to be organised in such a way that is fair to the whole of society. And when I say that, I mean that, you know, the wealth is generated in the South. Why should the South have the same NHS service they do in the North? I think that's ludicrous.
Do you? Because the South is wealthier?
Absolutely right, yes. We should have a health service that suits our environment, and so should the Northerners. They should have a health service too that suits their environment.
So what you're saying is that those
really controversial. I
understand so what you're saying is those that are wealthy should be prepared to pay through an insurance system or whatever it may be for their healthcare. Is that what you're suggesting?
That is what I'm suggesting.
Okay,
yeah. It sounds mad, but yes.
No, it doesn't sound mad. And then it would be rather like a welfare system, that the welfare system was there for those who were either out of work or on very low salaries, as opposed to those who were earning more. Jill, there is a logic to what you say. Whether there is a demand or a desire in this country for it is a separate thing, but thank you for making the point. Now, when it comes to putting money into the NHS, there was, of course, you may remember, during the referendum campaign, a bus that went around the country with a figure on the side of it. And that figure was 350 million a week should be given to the National Health Service. And boy, did that cause a row, because that was our gross contribution to the European Union, namely our contribution before the British rebate, which is now under threat, of course, in every way, before the British rebate was taken off, and before the money that comes back to us in the form of agricultural subsidy, regional support, etc., is taken off. And that's led to a massive row. And I do hope to never get another call from an LBC listener saying that I was somehow driving that bus around the country. I was very strongly opposed to that gross figure being used. Interestingly, so was Jacob Rees-Mogg. Jacob thought the figure was a mistake, that a lower figure, which still would have appeared huge to voters, but a lower figure that was more justifiable, should have been used. And Jacob explained in the last few days that he himself went in to meet the Vote Leave team to say, please don't do this. I myself, as I've said before, begged Michael Gove to drop it. I thought it was a rotten idea. But Jacob now says that actually a promise was a promise, and the one thing that would really give people faith, not just in the Brexit process and in the vote, but also that we were doing the utmost for the NHS, was we should increase spending on the National Health Service by 350 million a week. That's Jacob's suggestion, but that would be pushing on for 20 billion sterling, and I suspect if Philip Hammond increases it by 4 or 5 billion, that would be a lot. But Jacob thinks we should chuck 20 billion at it, and then everybody would be happy. I wonder what would make Alex in Bolton happy. What do we need to do, Alex, with our National Health Service?
Well, I love the MOG, that's for sure. But
right.
Certainly throwing no money at it is not going to solve the problem. My son works in the NHS. He's a porter. He's been there for 5 years. He spends most of his day transporting people over 25 stone around the hospital, or big families of non-British origin.
Yeah.
And he's a really altruistic kid. He honestly, everybody loves him. But even he comes back from work disillusioned by the waste that goes on in the hospital, the amount of managers they have. Many times he's only given 7 hours between shifts, so he'll finish at midnight and he's due back on at 7 in the morning.
So he's working hard.
He is working hard, but it's in complete and utter disarray. The management in the NHS, for me, they could just privatise the whole thing, because I actually think they'd get better return for their investment. Because, let's look at it. I'm financial controller for a manufacturing company that exports £12.5 million worth of equipment a year. We do about 5% in the UK, so, I'm into exports. I don't worry about Brexit. We deal on world trade terms all the time anyway.
And now your point, Alex.
In our company, we pay the absolute top rate of pension. We started it and we put it in straight away saying, right, 4%, you put 4%, we'll put 4%. Sounds really generous. NHS puts in 17% for the NHS workers. How can this be out of taxpayers' money?
Because it was felt, Alex, that people working in the National Health Service weren't being paid enough, I guess. Alex, I thank you for your points, and I will pick up in a moment on the treatment of non-British citizens within the National Health Service. It's a point I've raised before. It's contentious, but we do need to talk about it. You're listening to the Sunday edition of the Nigel Farage Show, exclusively on LBC. It's 11:30. On Thursday night, we talked about Zimbabwe. We talked about what looked like the end of 37 years of rule from Robert Mugabe. And I had a lot of Zimbabweans ringing in, some who thought he was a hero, others who thought he'd been an absolute disaster and a pretty barbarous dictator. But it looked like on Thursday, it appeared that he was gone. There'd been a military takeover. And then on Saturday, he pops up at a university ceremony, and there are big questions as to what's happening. So what we do know is that he's set to meet army chiefs at some point today, and indeed the governing ZANU-PF party itself is meeting to work out whether they should dismiss their founder and long-term leader. So it's all a little bit confusing. Perhaps to give us some clarity on this, I'm going to ask the Labour MP for Vauxhall and, importantly, the chair of the all-party parliamentary group on Zimbabwe, Kate Hoey. Good morning, Kate.
Good morning, Nigel.
So, as it stands, he's still in charge, is he?
No, he's not in charge at the moment, and for the last month or two, this has been being plotted by the ruling party, ZANU-PF, because they want to make sure that they get, when he was going to, he was getting on, he was 93, there's been all this discussion about who was going to take over when he left, big factions within ZANU-PF, one wanting his wife and one wanting Mnangagwa, who had been sent out of the country just a couple of weeks ago by Mugabe, and that was the catalyst then for the army, who've always supported Mnangagwa to come in. Now, Mugabe is a very, although he's very, very old, he's still quite alert at times, and he has obviously decided that he's not going to be forced out and is being stubborn. But no doubt about it, today he will be removed from being ZANU-PF leader, and then he will go. But it's what happens then is the important thing. And
the army very clearly not in favour of his wife, Gucci Grace, as she's become known. And clearly somebody that's rather enjoyed the high life and perhaps some of the bling that money can buy. But Kate, what process then would ZANU-PF go through to pick the next leader?
Well, I think what those who have got some political nous in Zimbabwe want to make sure that the international community see this as not being a coup as such, that it's done constitutionally. So there would be the opportunity for the parliament this week to impeach Mugabe if he doesn't resign. But given the huge amount of numbers of people out on the street in Harare and all over Zimbabwe yesterday, he couldn't have missed seeing that, Mugabe. And It may be that he wants to go with some dignity, and he will resign and be given some kind of, honorary this, that and the other. The reality is that people, even though there is huge delight about Mugabe going, there are still an awful lot of people who recognise that he was the great liberator and would not want to see him actually humiliated, despite all the terrible things he's done, and therefore he is likely to, I don't think we should be feeling any pity for him or sorrow for him, because they've stacked away millions of pounds all over the world, and he will want to go. I think if he knows that time is up, he will want to go so that he can be still able to move around and get access to that money. I don't think he's going to be, taken out and shot.
No. And Kate, finally, is this right now a moment of hope for the people of Zimbabwe?
Yes, I mean it is, and it's clear that this is a cathartic. You know, it's cathartic. They've got. If he goes, they've got rid of him. But what we have to see, there are elections due next year. They have to be free and fair, and the role of the international community, and particularly South Africa and SADC and the African Union, is to make sure that those are genuinely free and fair, because otherwise ZANU-PF will simply put in one despotic dictator for another, Mnangagwa, who was responsible for thousands of deaths and torture over the years, and we won't be in a better position. Zimbabweans are a very peaceful, loving people, and I think this could be the real opportunity now to get that country back up on its feet by getting a genuinely free and fair election. And we as the British government have to give as much support as we can to that.
Well, let's hope that happens. Kate, thank you very much for joining me this morning. Well, that was Kate Hoey, Labour MP for Vauxhall and chair of the all-party parliamentary group on Zimbabwe, making it clear that Mugabe is gone. It's over, but it's just a question of can they have full, free and fair elections at some point in Zimbabwe and perhaps get back on track. And can the NHS get back on track if it's given billions and billions of pounds of money, as 90 MPs are calling for, or is the money perhaps not being spent the right way? And Joan on Facebook, picking up on Dr. Bob's point earlier on in the show, says Bob is so right, and this should be made more known and stopped in its tracks. And what Bob said, he said the administrative expenditure within the National Health Service has gone from 3% of its budget to 14% of its budget, and that's what I think has got Joan worked up. Tough Ale says on Facebook, they spend billions on a system that does not work. The same goes with many other systems of government, yet no one ever seems to get fired. Well, it's a pretty fair point. I wonder what Paul in Sittingbourne. Paul, what can we do to help the NHS? It's at bursting point. I mean, I personally think it's the population crisis that has put this pressure on, but I know that's an unfashionable view in some circles. What would you do to make things better?
Hello, Nigel. It's lovely to talk to you.
Good morning.
Good morning, sir. Nigel, what I would do is on a Thursday, Friday and Saturday night, the NHS, if you go in the A&E, it is packed.
It's a war zone, isn't it? It's a war zone on a Friday night. Yeah,
it's like a war zone. What I would personally do, when they come out of these clubs and pubs, paralytic drunk, and they get an ambulance, and they take them to the A&E and they drop them off, I would personally be in there with a board and I would charge them £100 per time they come in. I'll say, right, you got drunk, you got paralytic, an ambulance has picked you up, that's £50 delivery charge, and here's £50 for service.
Well, Paul, if you were actually going to charge them the cost of that treatment, I'll tell you something, an ambulance and a crew going out to pick somebody up, an A&E ward with a nurse and a locum doctor or whoever's on duty, be a lot more than £100, wouldn't it?
Yeah, it would be, but it'd be a start price, and if you go in the second time, it'd be £200.
Right.
And the maximum would be £400-500, something like that.
All right. No, I understand. I understand what you're saying. Now, what would you do, Paul, say in the middle of February, and someone who's been a smoker all their life gets a bad chest infection that starts to turn a bit pneumonic, and they're taken in to A&E? Would you charge them?
I would charge them for smoking £100. If you've got cancer, then that is different. If you've got terminal cancer, that's different. But if you've got chest infection because you're smoking, I would charge you £100.
Right, okay.
You know what you're doing with your body. You know what I mean?
I think under your system it could be very expensive for some of us. And what about fat people, Paul? So somebody who is, we heard earlier, woman phoned from Bolton and said that her son's a porter and has to move people around who weigh, she said, 25 stone or more. So someone's, 25 stone, they're grossly overweight, morbidly obese, and they start to get a bit of a flutter. And so they're brought in to have an ECG. How much do we charge them?
I would charge them £100 as well, mate.
Right.
I would keep on it. I tell you, Nigel.
Would anybody that goes to A&E not pay £100?
Because he spent hundreds and hundreds of pounds for food. He just sits there, he shoves food down his own throat, and it's his own fault. So I would charge him. I would bill him for it and say, right, you've done it. You want an operation, you want a gastric band, £500.
Well,
you've got free, we charge that.
But where would you draw the line? I mean, would 13 stone be too fat, or would 20? I mean, where would you decide that somebody?
I'll say around 18 stone.
18 stone.
18 stone. Yeah, I'll say 18 stone.
So 18 stone's the cut-off. And what about alcohol? Would there be a breathalyser to see whether you've drunk enough to be charged £100, or...?
No, when they bring you out, when the police are called and they say, right, you're going to have to go to A&E because you're paralytic,
yeah.
I would then turn around and say, right, call an ambulance. As soon as they call an ambulance, boom, you're fined £100 or £200.
Do you drink, Paul?
Just a sausage roll. Pardon?
Do you drink?
No, I don't drink no more.
Right. Do you smoke, Paul?
I don't drink no more. I don't smoke. No, I've never smoked in my life.
Right.
My dad smoked.
But I just
smoked when he went in hospital. He should be charged for it.
Did I just hear you order a sausage roll in the background?
I'm having a sausage roll, yeah, but I'm 6'4", Nigel.
Yeah.
And I'm 13 stone 4 ounces.
Well, there you go. Paul, you're not going to get charged a beam, but thank you very much for the call. Actually, the point Paul's making is a point that many make, particularly, they say, when there are people who, through their own fault, through getting drunk and involved in fights, cause all sorts of problems in the National Health Service. Many people think we should charge them. I have to say, Paul's regime is pretty tough. There aren't many of us, I think, that would ever go there and not pay £100. You're listening to the Sunday edition of the Nigel Farage Show, exclusively on LBC. It's 11:45. 90 members of Parliament, cross-party, are urging the Prime Minister and the Chancellor in the budget this week to pour billions into the NHS. It's in crisis. Many doctors and nurses are at or over capacity as we speak. We touched earlier on foreign nationals being treated within the National Health Service. It's an issue that I've raised in the past and, of course, been screamed at for daring to talk about it. But £2 billion a year is the cost of health tourism in this country. You may say that's a small part of the overall health budget, but hey, it's still £2 billion. Now, our previous caller, Paul from Sittingbourne, suggesting that actually grossly overweight people, smokers, drinkers should pick up the pieces of some of the cost, but I get by text, never mind drink and cigarettes, what about drugs? Yeah, very good. I mean, I don't know. I don't know what A&E departments have to put up with from people on drugs. I would imagine it's probably, in some parts of the country, a very big problem. Don in Hernhill disagrees vigorously and says tax from alcohol covers hospital costs. Well, Don, I remember being told that smoking-related diseases cost the National Health Service £2 billion a year, and some say it could be as high as £3 billion a year. Yeah, tax revenue is £11 billion a year, so you could look at it that way too if you wanted to. Nigel, I live in the south of England and I'm not wealthy. What should I do, says Alfie? Well, that was a suggestion we had earlier, that actually the NHS should be like the benefit system. It should be there for people on lower incomes, and those on higher incomes should provide their own insurance. It's not something that I think is very popular. And the other issue that you've been talking about is however much money we put in, how much of it is being lost through waste or this massive increase in middle management within the National Health Service. Charles in Birmingham is my next caller. Good morning, Charles.
Good morning, Nigel.
So what's to be done, Charles?
Well, I don't want to give them any more money because they waste too much. Now, let me two incidents. The first is interpreters. They cost £150 an hour to interpret for people in the hospital and doctors. And if they do 10 minutes, they still get £150 an hour. That's one thing we could cut out.
Right.
And the other thing is waste on Zimmer frames, clutches, walking sticks, wheelchairs. Once they've been used, they are put to scrap and scrapped out instead of being refurbished. How much is that costing us?
Sorry, so if somebody gets given a Zimmer frame...
Yes.
And then that person dies or doesn't need it anymore...
It's scrapped. They don't want it back. All the same when they come out, it's scrapped.
So are you saying that in the case of a brand new Zimmer frame, so someone's had a hip replacement or whatever it is,
yes,
and they can't get around their house without the use of a Zimmer frame for a 6-week period or whatever it may be, are you telling me that the hospital don't take that Zimmer frame back? Yes,
and I can prove that. My neighbour, who died a couple of years ago, and I know someone who died recently, they had Zimmer frames, and so one of their relatives come to me and says, can you get rid of these? She scraps. Someone will take scrap, and they scraps. My mother-in-law stayed here for a few weeks because she didn't get in the flat, and she had a commode. And we said, "Do you want it back?" No, scrap it. And we have to take it to the scrap. Yes, we have. And if you walk around, people have these. I'll tell you, they are scrapped because they've been used and stretched.
Wow.
And that's not me. That's what the NHS say.
Well, I don't know what a brand new sim of rain would cost the NHS to buy, but it's a reasonable sum of money, isn't it? And there must be I don't know, tens of thousands of them, perhaps hundreds of thousands of them that are given out. Charles, you've raised a very interesting point, not something I have to say that I was aware of. Charles from Birmingham, thank you for your call. And Charles saying a lot of this stuff is given to people, and rather than being reused and perhaps lasting for years, it simply gets scrapped. James in Tooting is on the line. James, good morning to you.
Good morning, Nigel. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. So we keep putting... Whenever you hear people talk about cuts, James, there are no cuts. We keep on putting more and more money into the National Health Service, and yet the thing is completely at capacity. And if we get a flu crisis this winter, there's going to be one hell of a problem.
Yeah, my understanding is that the majority of governments, barring one of the last 30 years, have increased the budget towards the NHS in relative terms.
Yes.
That being said, just to play on one of my own experiences of the NHS in the last couple of weeks, I actually tore a ligament and dislocated my thumb. I had to take a trip to A&E, sat in A&E to get it sorted, and you go in and fill a form and it says, right, where's the injury? The injury is in my left hand and it's my left thumb. I then get through to the nurse who, the poor person, tries to go through the list of about 15,000 different options to choose my x-ray. Now, my point is... we're going to have to increase funding towards the NHS, but where is that funding actually being spent? Is that to paper the cracks, or is that long-term projects that will help increase efficiency? Because it's not me, it's irrelevant, people going in and putting more money, but if I have to sit in the queue, fill in all the information that they need, and then that poor person has to go through a list of 15,000 different options, when common sense dictates that I'm here for my thumb, and it's my thumb that needs an x-ray.
All right, so what you're saying, James, actually is the whole thing is just grossly bureaucratic.
Completely.
Yeah. And when you got treatment, how good was the treatment?
The treatment is fantastic. When it comes to the staff, I think nobody ever disagrees that the quality of care you get from the NHS.
Yeah. I have to say, James...
If I could touch on one point, on the sort of privatisation point.
Yeah, go on, quickly.
I don't disagree. I do disagree with privatisation to an extent. On the whole, in most industries, I agree with it, but in the same as the train lines and the NHS, when there is no competition, because you do not choose if you are in an accident which hospital you would prefer to go to, then privatisation is not successful in those industries.
Because you can't provide proper competition. No, James, I thank you. And look, my experience of A&E is I was in a major road traffic accident back in 1985, multiple fractures of leg, skull, goodness knows what else. I also had a plane crash. So twice I've been wheeled into A&Es in a pretty rough condition. And I have to say, if you're an emergency, the NHS is amazingly brilliant. Whether it's as good at diagnostics and other things is a separate debate. Breaking news. Kate Hoey was absolutely right with her prediction just 15 minutes ago. Robert Mugabe has been dismissed as the leader of the ruling ZANU-PF party, according to Reuters. Former Vice President Emerson Mnangagwa has been appointed the new leader of the party in a widely expected move, according to party sources. So Kate was suggesting that if the former Vice President takes over, frankly... And her words were, that'll be no better because he himself has been directly responsible for torture and the death of thousands. Maybe not the bright new dawn that those people out campaigning on the streets of Harare yesterday would have hoped for. Back to the National Health Service, back to the 90 MPs demanding billions. They're going to get more money in the budget this week, I'm certain of that. They're not going to get Jacob Rees-Mogg's call for £350 million a week. I don't think would be very... I suspect it to be very popular if they did. And I'm not actually sure whether the Chancellor wants in this budget to reduce the deficit or not. But I don't see them pumping in £20 billion. Anne in Edinburgh, what's wrong with the National Health Service?
Can I first say that I've had to say a different name because I will be known. I'm in one of the senior management positions.
Okay.
For number one, 5 years ago, we had one person in the middle management role. We now have 5.
Wow.
The other problem that we really have is that nobody takes accountability for their spending. It costs around about £7,000 to recruit somebody, but they recruit and they get rid of and they don't look after their staff. They take on the very lowest people that they can possibly afford to have who then just go, or they ask ridiculous amounts of qualifications for a fairly low post and they just leave. So that's one of the main things. The other problem is stationery. Anybody who works in the NHS will know that unless somebody has their own personal responsibility for their own budget, people don't come and take one sheaf of paper. They take a whole box, or they take a box of pens, or they do anything like that. And until you bring the finances into somebody's personal pocket.
And we're out of time. We're out of time, which is a great shame. And I know it's not your name because you don't want to be identified, but I think what you said, that a few years ago in your department there was one person doing middle management, admin, and there are now 5, says an awful lot. Thank you very much indeed, and for being brave enough to ring in. And to say that, you've been listening to the Nigel Farage Show here on LBC. I'll be back tomorrow evening at 7. Coming up at 3 o'clock this afternoon, it's Alex Salmond. But up next, it's Majid Nawaz.
Thank you, Nigel.